Our next speaker is Jens Tuider, who is a philosopher from Germany. He is part of Melanie Joy's organization KAN. The workshop organized by Jens aims at providing those speaking out for animals with sound arguments for both everyday situations and more particular purposes. Please welcome Jens Tuider.
So, hello everyone. Can you hear me all right? Is that good? Okay. I need to be sitting because my back is giving me some trouble today, so bear with me, please. Welcome to the Animal Rights Workshop. My name is Jens, and I would like to thank you all for coming, and I would like to thank the organizers of this conference for making things possible. I think they're doing an incredible job, and I'm really delighted to be here. This workshop builds on, continues last year's workshop, but it does not build on it. So those who were not here last year, don't worry that you missed anything, and those who were here last year, don't worry about any kind of double information or repetitions. Another thing I need to mention is that this workshop also is or strives to contribute to a comprehensive online arguments database, which I already planned last year. And even though I had planned for this project to be finished by now, there have been some technical hiccups and more work on my part as I had planned. So it won't be long before this is going to materialize now. For those of you who wish to receive further information about this arguments database, which will also include all the arguments discussed here today and also hopefully your contributions, please feel free to contact me on this address. Right. This is the plan for this session. I'll first be giving you kind of an introduction, concept of the workshop, and I will also talk a bit about the limits of rational argumentation, and then we'll just get started with the arguments. So first, a terminological remark. This is the animal rights workshop, so I need to say a few words about that term. I'll be using the term animal rights in its broadest possible sense, and that is including the liberationist or abolitionist position, and I will be setting it apart from the traditional animal welfare position. So most of you already are acquainted with this standard tripartite division of animal advocacy, so I don't really need to get into any detail here. Do I? No, not really. Okay, so basically animals or animal welfare is about animals have no rights or just some kind of second-class moral status, whereas animal rights holds that animals do have rights and are basically equal to human beings. The difference between animal rights in the narrow sense and animal liberation is the kind of rights that are being attributed to animals. So animal liberation crucially adds one more right, and that is the right to be free, to the other rights not to suffer, the right to live, and so on. So to be free and not to be instrumentalized or used by human beings in any way, that is the crucial difference. However, this is not really relevant for us here today because this workshop is designed to address arguments in general for animal rights in general, and therefore does not presuppose any specific position within this animal rights spectrum. Now for the concept of this workshop, first we need to determine the type of arguments we'll be dealing with here. And basically there are 4 types of arguments concerning animal-related issues which reflect different kinds of goals, motivations, reasons behind them. First there are arguments concerning the life and well-being of animals, of course. Then there are arguments focusing on the life and well-being of other humans. There are arguments focusing on one's own health and well-being, and there are arguments focusing on the mostly natural or otherwise environment. These 4 types can be roughly grouped into 2 categories, which is the ethical or moral arguments on the one side. They are altruistic, or as we also say, other regarding, and then there are the what we call prudential arguments, so arguments related to prudence, to wisdom. They are usually egoistic or self-regarding. Strictly speaking, only the first type, so the life and well-being of animals, is related to animal rights, as it concerns animals directly and is non-selective with regard to the practices affecting animals. But it covers all possible practices. All other types concern animals only indirectly, so that is, animals are not really the objects of primary concern, but something else is. And they are also selective. That means they only cover specific practices. So the second type, for example, would only cover those practices which, for example, lead to food injustice or other forms of injustice between humans, or negatively impact people working in the animal industry. And the other types would only cover practices harmful to one's own health or the environment or nature, but leaving other practices which do not have these kinds of effects, of course, untouched. Even though none of the last three types of arguments are based on the premise of animal rights, they nevertheless can, and I feel also should, be made use of to further at least some of the goals of animal rights. This workshop, however, will focus primarily on the first type, on the direct moral arguments, on the ethical arguments. And it will consider the other types of arguments only in as far as they are relevant, and the same goes for empirical aspects. So we won't be dealing with arguments such as a vegan diet isn't healthy, right? Or organic farming is impossible without animals. These kinds of empirical arguments will not be our primary concern here. The reason for this limitation is that direct moral arguments not only have the only true connection with animal rights, but also pose the greatest challenge to proponents of animal rights, as I see that, as they fall outside the established intra-human morality and don't coincide with human self-interest. Moreover, they can't be supported by empirical evidence or scientific findings. So we can, for instance, determine whether humans need to consume animal products in order to live healthily by simply running studies and analyzing the data. But we can't do this in ethics. There is no empirical methodology or evidence to guide us in a similar fashion. Therefore, ethical questions are notoriously difficult, and moral questions concerning animals are even more challenging, since we can't simply invoke the established intra-human moral practice to back up our case. This is why we'll center our attention on these kinds of arguments. A further clarification is in order, however. This workshop is not primarily about foundational arguments for animal rights. So that is, we won't be reflecting a lot on the proper basis for the attribution of animal rights and the relevant criteria, like being sentient or the subject of a life, having inherent value or dignity, being involved in a relationship with a moral agent, and so on, which are the classic kinds of criteria. Instead, this workshop is designed to familiarize you with the standard objections to animal rights and the most common defenses of established practices involving animals. And is also designed to analyze those skeptical arguments against animal rights and identify and collect sound counter-arguments or rebuttals in support of animal rights. So that's basically what we are going to do. I'm going to confront you with the critical or skeptical arguments, and we will try to find the most fitting responses there. Okay, now let me briefly talk about the limits of rational argumentation, because I feel this aspect has long been underestimated and has become a source of potential frustration for many animal rights activists. With the main idea of this workshop being to share, discuss, scrutinize, and develop arguments, this phrase here, by the philosopher Daniel Dennett, would make a fine motto for this workshop, wouldn't it? So there's nothing I like less than bad arguments for a view I hold dear. Now, at least this was my motto when I started thinking about arguments and counter-arguments in the context of animal rights. I liked this motto because it sat well with my generally optimistic assessment of and my trust in the power of rational argumentation. And it was perfectly in line with my conviction that all I needed to do, in fact, was to make sure my arguments were sound and success would be on my side. I felt vindicated, in my view, by the fact that humans love to conceive of themselves as rational creatures who solve controversial matters by resorting to rational discourse and then act accordingly. Of course, I was terribly wrong, and matters are not quite as simple as that. The main reason for this is the fact that human beings are only potentially rational creatures who more often than not choose not to make proper use of this faculty. Instead, most humans very often resort to their cognitive capacities merely in order to rationalize their irrational behavior, which is in fact primarily governed by emotions, subconscious drives, desires, habits, convictions, acquired tastes, preferences, and so on. Unfortunately, this also applies to the animal issue. So very often the arguments against animal rights are not really arguments, but actually rationalizations, or reflect other psychological defense mechanisms. Very often skeptics of animal rights don't use their arguments simply because they are unaware of the truth or incidentally get some of the facts wrong, but because these arguments are supposed to work as defenses of habits and customs they have grown to like, or at least support, and don't wish to break. This insight has consequences for the project of rational discourse, which has been aptly phrased by the feminist animal rights philosopher Carol J. Adams. She says, two kinds of people exist in the world, those who want answers to their questions and those who don't. More important than knowing the answers to questions is having the skill to tell the difference between these people. So she's talking about questions here, but the same applies for arguments, I suppose. In other words, very often the arguments or the skeptical questions don't need to be answered. What sometimes is more important is to identify what Adams calls the question behind the question. And she goes on, quote, "Questions reveal a great deal more than most of us realize. Listen to their questions, not to answer them, but as explanations," unquote. So what conclusion can be drawn from this observation, which is rather pessimistic and depressing? Should we go and give up rational discourse and argumentation altogether? Well, apparently not. Otherwise, there would be no point in offering this workshop, would there be? Instead, I believe that while we should keep the flag of rational argumentation flying, we, at the same time, need to take into account human psychology, which is often irrational, twisted, and contradictory. And we have to acknowledge the limitations of this approach. We must not overburden this approach, but assess its effectiveness realistically in order to avoid counterproductive consequences on both sides. As activists, this awareness might help us to better avoid frustrations and everything that goes with it, like cynicism and sarcasm, bitterness, and so on. When we realize that rational argumentation just isn't working in a specific situation or with specific people. But awareness of the psychological mechanisms involved might also help us to avoid frustrations on part of the people we are trying to reach with our arguments. This can be achieved by appreciating the fact that presenting arguments requires a certain amount of care and sensitivity in order not to intimidate interlocutors by wrongly giving the impression that we are taking the moral high ground. People usually, and you might all have made these experiences yourself, don't take very kindly to the idea of being lectured on moral issues. And they most certainly don't like it if they are being made to feel deficient, humiliated, or inferior in the moral department. In this context, we should pay special attention to avoid any polemic, disrespectful, or condescending language. Because there's one thing we need to bear in mind. Rational argumentation is not a war or a battle, and arguments are certainly not weapons. However, every cloud has a silver lining, as we say, so acknowledging the limitations of rational argumentation in animal rights advocacy also requires us to look for surrogate or supplementary strategies. I'll very briefly share with you my idea of a comprehensive and integrative approach, and introduce to you what I consider the four cornerstones of animal rights advocacy. So first there is the rational argumentation to refute common misconceptions, errors about specific aspects. That's the animal rights arguments, what we will be doing here. But this is not the only one, as you can see. Second, there is raising awareness about the all-encompassing, deeply entrenched and institutionalized system enabling and maintaining animal abuse, including all the various psychological mechanisms the whole system depends on. Third, there is raising awareness of animals' capabilities and thus setting straight the distorted picture of animals to facilitate the transition to viewing animals as individuals. So you can generalize from certain anecdotes about the fantastic things animals can do, and hopefully people will generalize from these particular observations and come to understand that animals can do much more and are much more vulnerable in many respects as they usually think they are. And fourth, there is relating one's own story, one's own development towards a vegan lifestyle, addressing the benefits as well as the obstacles. And of course, providing and sharing practical information how the transition to an animal-friendly life is possible. Right, and you can see with the colors of the first two cornerstones more or less appeal to rationality, right, whereas the other two rather appeal to emotions, because I think that animal advocacy really needs or depends on a hearts and minds approach. Be that as it may, the crucial thing to understand here is that rational argumentation is only one element of an animal rights advocacy strategy. This element is neither sufficient nor sometimes even necessary, depending on the situation and the kind of people you're dealing with. Therefore, it often needs to be replaced or backed up by other elements. So to sum things up, I still believe that rational argumentation can play an important part in our struggle for animal rights. And I still believe that whenever you have to fall back onto arguments, you had better make sure they are sound. And this is where philosophy can make a significant contribution to the practical work of animal rights advocates and activists. But I've also made some cautionary remarks in order to put things into perspective and to avoid raising wrong expectations that cannot be fulfilled. Because rational argumentation, unfortunately, to my mind, can't work miracles. However, on condition of having a realistic understanding of both the possibilities and limitations of rational argumentation, I believe a certain repertoire of sound rebuttals of some of the skeptic arguments might prove a valuable asset in winning people over for the cause of animal rights and thus creating a better world for animals. Right, so let's get started with the arguments. Unless, of course, there are any comments, questions concerning my rather pessimistic and cautious assessment. If this is not the case, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to throw a skeptical argument on the screen, confront you with that, and then we'll be collecting your responses. I don't know exactly how we're going to do this because we do not have a wireless mic. So there are two options. Either the people who want to speak go to the microphone, which is probably logistically not very wise. The other option would be that you just maybe stand up, speak up, or maybe just turn around a bit, try to create some kind of surround effect, and so everyone can understand what you want to say. Right, and as soon as we've collected or spent enough time with one of these arguments and collected what you find is a good rebuttal, a good counter-argument to that, I'm going to briefly show you what I think are some of the essential, some of the good arguments. And of course, my list is not exhaustive, right? So this is just a first elaboration. And I would greatly appreciate your participation because the outcome of this whole event here is very much depends on your contributions. And I would like to encourage the experts among you. I can see one there sitting. Stas, right? To share your experience, right? So there are lots of people here probably who have not this experience and who would appreciate very much to be informed and get some of this information themselves. You ready? Right, here goes. Number one. I always use this as the first one because it's a very basic one. There are more important and urgent things in the world than animal rights. Why bother about the ethically sound treatment of animals as long as there are still people living in abysmal conditions, suffering from various injustices and dying from hunger, wars and horrible diseases? Haven't you heard that one? I did. Right. So, hands up. What do you think? Or what is your standard reply? What is a good reply? Why is it a good reply, or maybe not? So, your turn. The man in the back. Could you stand up and speak?
I'm not sure my reply is the most efficient one, because I've never had great success with it, but my standard reply is, why should the species difference, which is a biological difference, have any moral, ethical significance?
Okay, so you say there's no moral difference. All right, good. So it doesn't really matter whether we get engaged in some kind of animal cause or human-related cause. Right, good. Another hand?
One of the things I say, and again, may not be the right thing, but I try to say, to disarm people and say, well, I feel like we're all given inspiration to champion certain causes and raise awareness. Yours might be about this, but this is what mine is about, so I want to speak on that behalf. Inspiration comes in many forms to many people on many topics for valid reasons.
Yeah, very good. I share this view, absolutely. And there are so many different kinds of people, so we can expect for the different causes to find enough people to deal with that. I don't know who was first, but maybe you would like to.
I would say that everybody could hide behind such an argument by saying that we can always point out there are worse things in the world happening, but we have to start somewhere. And when we can start here, why not just do it?
Yeah, very good. Right. So you think that this principle of urgency, right, or this priority thing, has very, very counterintuitive consequences when you think it through, right? So if you apply it to humans, you could also say, why care about, I don't know, people who are ill, as long as there are people who are in a much worse condition than that. So maybe doctors should only treat the worst cases of disease and injuries and forget about all the others. Right? That would have very counterintuitive consequences to apply this principle of urgency, because that is a principle of urgency. Right? So there are more important things, deal with the more important things first, and then let's deal with the less important stuff later on. Absolutely. I don't know who was first. There are so many hands up. Maybe let's do it, ladies and gentlemen. Take it in turns, right? Maybe you.
Okay, so I always say that empathy, you cannot divide it. And if you have empathy for animals, you also have empathy for people. And why does someone assume that I don't do anything for the people? And then I ask him, so what do you do for the people? Just tell me, because maybe I will be inspired by you. And they usually don't have the answer for this.
But you don't really expect inspiration, do you?
They never did. Not only once, they never did. And I also say that take the grain under the consideration. There's enough grain and corn and all those stuff to feed the animals for producing meat. You can put the grain to the Africa or poor countries, and you can feed the whole poverty with this grain. So why I'm not eating meat, so I'm taking care of those people.
Right, very good. So you're basically making two arguments here, right? You're saying, no, it's important. There are two things you're saying. The one thing is, even if you only focus on animal rights, you some kind of indirectly also support human issues, right? On the other hand,
For the environment also, because the people don't see the connection between those two. Like
exactly,
milk or meat and the environment.
exactly.
The poverty and stuff. So they start realizing there's something else behind being a vegan, like more conscious way of living.
Exactly. So, and the first thing you said was that people who have this tendency to be activists for one cause have a stronger tendency to also care about other things. Exactly. So,
Then I'm talking about environment.
Exactly. But it's a strange thing that the people some kind of reproach you for being active for the wrong issue, right? Whereas they themselves are not involved in anything. So that's a little bit strange. Indeed. Very good. Further arguments?
Maybe one that is quite efficient on the street when I listen or information.
Could you speak up a little bit, please?
Yeah, one that is really efficient is to ask the people who say this, why don't you say to people who are shopping that there are more important and urgent things than the shopping? Or why don't they go to coffee and say, oh, you know, people, there are more important things than drinking coffee, maybe you should do something? They realize that actually they ask these questions about the animal rights because actually it's a defense from their part, not involve themselves in animal rights. Also, another possibility of answering is linked with the presentation that was yesterday and saying that there is a study showing that the more people have speciesist beliefs, the more they are racist. So when we challenge speciesism, we also challenge racism, and so we also help humans.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, the thing is, almost anything we do in the Western world to enjoy life is not as important as other issues, right? So you can easily use that. Some people collect cars or whatever. That is certainly not a very fundamental, or is not a very fundamental importance. Right, any further? Stas, please.
First, I'd like to point out that, as you said, this, I think, is not a question looking to be answered.
Absolutely.
Because in my experience with talking to people, it's not the people who do things for humans that ask that question. You would never hear an activist for human rights go and ask you, oh, why are you doing that? Because he knows why he's doing his activism, so he knows that other forms of activism are also effective. That is exactly what you said. So this is not a question looking to be answered. But if you still want to go and answer that, I think it is important to point out first that through fighting for this cause, as you said, you are changing other things, because people who are involved in enlarging their circle of empathy, you're also usually enlarging your circle of empathy not only to animals but also to people. You change the way you act in accordance with the general thought that you care about other people's lives, other animals' lives, other creatures' lives. If you do not eat, if you do not abuse animals, then you would probably be also against abuse of people of other colors, other races, other sexual priorities. It doesn't matter. It will be quite hard to find people who are very homophobic in the animal rights advocacy movement. You don't really see that. So I think that by fighting for this issue, you are fighting for other issues. It is also for me important to point out that this is an issue which is extremely big in all its implications, in the amount of beings that are hurt and the amount of people who act to change this is comparatively very small. So you have a lot of people who do very valuable human rights activism, but not a lot of people who do this. And to say, well, you just want to fight this one thing, you can't just fight one thing. You have to fight all those issues, and I am choosing to fight this issue because for me, this issue is the biggest one by the amount of harm that is being done to living sentient beings, and there are not enough people who are doing that. So those are a few points I talked about.
Thanks a lot, Stas.
Yes, just to come back to this question now, and people who've mentioned the environment, quite recently we've been with a lot of anti-fracking groups, and they have asked this very question, and my reply to them is, well, why are you bothered about fracking when you're eating animals? So it doesn't always go hand in hand, and this question is recently been quite a lot asked by anti-fracking groups.
So that would be against this assumption that people who are activists, that they generally understand why people become activists, so they're very often specific about this and selective, highly selective, some people, because they feel they need more support for their own cause usually, right? So they're trying to reproach you of following or supporting the wrong thing, right? Steen.
Yeah. The curious thing is that all the things that you mentioned on human suffering and so on, they can be replied like people living in abysmal conditions. Look at the slaughterhouse workers. They get perpetration-induced traumatic stress. The injustices that was mentioned also in my presentation yesterday evening, that speciesism triggers racism. Hunger, that's mentioned, that vegans have a lower footprint and it's better for food security. And especially horrible diseases. We may not realize it, but I've looked it up, the studies. We had the Mexican swine flu, originated in pig farms. Now also the most terrible flu in history, the Spanish flu, killed 20 to 100 million people, more than in the First World War. And that originated also in pig farms. So if we were vegans for millennia, we did not have the Spanish flu, who killed almost 100 million people.
We wouldn't have plenty of problems.
And yeah, I can give you a long list of all the zoonotic diseases that are already created and that we will create. So no wonder why a lot of World Health Organization and so on, they say factory farming is really risky.
Excellent. Thank you, Steen. So this is the indirect argument, more or less. Even though we work for the animal rights thing, indirectly we also contribute to human issues, and therefore this kind of reproach is ill-founded. Right, in the back, please, there.
Yes, I would argue that establishing absolute priority.
Could you stand up, please?
I would argue that establishing absolute priorities, like in this case humans come first, is foolish and irresponsible. Because if you would look at the claim, for our fellow creatures, we are more responsible than for foreigners. And we could maybe accept this as a behavioral rule in a case of conflict, but we would not be it would be completely absurd to help foreigners only if all our fellow creatures' needs would be met. It also would be absurd to say, I will only donate money for children in Africa when my own children all have their own TV. Or maybe let us take the really sensible priority. Surviving is more important than equality. And even here an absolute claim would be irresponsible. You would immediately realize that you can't say, how can we fight for the equality of women as long as people in Africa are killing each other? So it's not a question of these abstract priorities, but one where we are personally confronted with suffering and injustice. It would be foolish to say, arriving at a place of an accident, to say, unfortunately, I cannot help these people because elsewhere there are far more terrible accidents.
Absolutely. I'm looking for them, right? Right, very good point, thank you. So you argued against the... You argued against this kind of lexical priority, so only when all humans' issues are solved, then we can start addressing other things, absolutely. I think it's a different matter, as you said, in very specific situations where you have to choose, right? Dilemmatic situations, where you can only, the classic thing, do you rescue your baby or your dog out of the burning house? This is one of these very, very specific situations where you can say, there is a closer relationship and that's why I choose because I only have these two options. But this does not provide a basis for a general moral code. I'd say that is what is trying to be done here. Right. There are lots of more things to come, but please, one last reply. Right?
I see all these arguments as very good to a person who would like to listen to them. This question for me is the question of somebody who was like fearing something or was not open to rational arguments. So what I would do would be maybe go from my head to my heart and try to listen to this fear first, to empathize with the person, like saying, are you feeling overwhelmed when you see all the struggles that should be achieved in the work, something like that. And they're trying to empathize, and then to give all this.
I think that is a very important point. Thank you. Absolutely. This is what I meant at the beginning. You need sensitivity to use these arguments, right? You should not use them as weapons and to just to beat the others, right? To win this fight or this battle, because in the long run you will lose these people, right? Don't humiliate them. Don't give them the feeling like, oh my God, I'm such a bad person, and there are such do-gooders, right? That's a very important point. You need sensitivity, right? And sometimes you don't even need to answer these things, right? That's what I also said. Right. You want to see what I collected very briefly? The good thing is you almost hit all of them. It's unbelievable. You're very, very good. So this argument creates a dilemmatic situation between competing worthy causes. But these causes are not exclusive or require hierarchy. Many social reformers, Henry Stephen Salt, for example, or other people, prove that point wrong as they work for several human and animal causes simultaneously. So these classical charges of animal preferentialism or even misanthropy, right? So these animal rights people love animals more than they love humans. They're absolutely unfounded, I think. This argument is in fact speciesist and I think also inconsistent because its logic is only applied when one of the competing causes is related to animals. This seems to suggest that human animals have lexical priority. So those working for the, for ill children, they would not be chastised for not working for the children dying of hunger, right? Or those working for the elderly people would never get a reproach, why don't you care about the dying children in Africa? And so this is this rather inconsistent application and the speciesist kind of premise behind this. Then we also have this one, the principle of urgency or priority. If it were applied consistently, it would have dramatic and counterintuitive consequences for intra-human morality. So we could only deal with the most urgent cases, right? Somebody broke a leg, just queue, right? And wait until it's your time because we've got people dying of cancer and brain tumors. We've got to deal with them first, right? You just have to wait a couple of years. So that really doesn't work that way. So even if we applied it consistently in intra-human morality, it would be absurd. The only thing nobody pointed out was that this argument overlooks the distinction between what philosophers call weak positive duties and strong negative duties, and the fact that supporting animal rights only requires refraining from certain actions. Weak duties or positive duties usually are duties which oblige you or imply that you have to help, that you have to do something actively, you have to support somebody, or you have to do something. Whereas negative duties just tell you not to do certain things. You just refrain from action, right? You're not required to do something, actually just refrain from that. And in fact, supporting animal rights only requires you to refrain from doing certain things. You just stop eating animals, you just stop buying animal products, and so on. You don't really have to campaign for this. Right? So that's something, because some people think, in order to support animal rights, I have to become an activist myself, I have to go out on the streets, do all kinds of things. No. In animal rights, the good thing is you can be an activist by just refraining from all these things and not being part of supporting these practices. Right, even if active animal rights advocacy, and that's what probably refers to us, does take up time and energy, there are crucial differences to most other causes that justify it even more so. Animals can't speak up for themselves. There's a lack of public awareness, lack of moral consensus, and at least indirect involvement of large parts of the population. I think that is also an argument where you can say there is a good reason to do that, and this is not always true for all the human-related issues. Right, and the last one is, which has also been pointed out by you, is that many aspects of human and animal welfare are in fact interconnected or intersected. So those who work for animal rights, for example, also often, even if only sometimes indirectly, support human-related issues and thus contribute to creating a better world for humans as well. I put this as the last one because it's an indirect argument. So this just addresses the problem not because of animal rights, but because of the effects it has on other humans. Right, so that's just a recap. I don't need that here. So, number 2. I call this bringing into existence makes right. That sounds a bit technical probably to most of you, but that's a philosophical term. Domesticated animals owe their existence to us. And there's in brackets a kind of implicit premise, which is mostly not articulated, but which is behind there. Existence is always better than non-existence, or bringing into existence is always a benefit for this being. Therefore, we are justified to deal with animals as we please. Right? So this is the classic argument. I think 200 years ago, somebody said the pig has the biggest or strongest interest in bacon, right? Because otherwise it would not be there. At least it is produced by human beings, it is brought into existence, it has a life, short though it may be, but it has a life, and that's better than never having existed. Right? So, is that convincing? Is that a knockdown argument for you? I do not hope so. Yes, please. Can you stand up, please? You can also use the microphone, you're quite close to it.
So first of all, I would say, well, you know, if you have a baby, you've brought that into existence and you can't kill that. But that's a little bit out there. So what about if your dog has puppies? If you were to kill them, that would still be wrong and disgusting. So what's the difference between a dog or a cow?
Okay, good, thank you. Stas, again?
This premise is basically wrong, and most people know it is a basically wrong premise, because most people would rather, for example, abort a very, very, very sick fetus, or they would rather not be connected to machines prolonging their life solely to have a life in a complete coma. So most people already agree that existence is not always better than non-existence. So claiming that to bring an animal to a life of constant pain and suffering, most people already agree that that existence is no better than non-existence.
Very good, thank you. Very important point. Yes, please.
And another one, and I say always, like, some time ago, it was not that long ago, people thought in America that black people were just for our pleasure and for being slaves. And people really thought that, like Nazis also thought that Jews, they can do whatever they want with them because they are only Jews. And now people think that animals are only animals, and this one will change too. Because it always ended that way, it changed.
Right. Very good. I think there's a difference between the Jews and the slaves, because the slaves were indeed produced or brought into existence by slave owners. They were also encouraged to multiply because they were a workforce, which is not true with the Nazi and the Jews, because they rather tried the opposite. Yeah, but the treatment is similar, but the Nazis did not bring Jews into existence in order to, rather the opposite, unfortunately. Absolutely. Right. Yes. Good. Any more? Yes, please.
Children owe their existence to their parents. Doesn't mean that the parents can do everything to their children.
Yeah, absolutely. Very good point. Yeah, I think that's been made before. That's closely related to what you already said.
This is more like a comment. I see a lot of comparison between obviously humans and animals, and people don't really respond well to that. So how do you respond to that when people say it's not the same, humans and animals? Obviously, it's the whole debate. But if they go back to you saying, "Well, you can't even discuss that," so how do you understand that? How can you?
Because they have this speciesist kind of a presupposition. There's a difference.
When I tell them that, they say, "There's no. What are you talking about? It's completely different." So, yeah.
I don't have to answer this because there's so many hands.
I always then relate to dogs and cats because they're also animals and people love dogs and cats. They would never hurt a dog or a cat.
Yeah, so more like, domestic animals.
But domestic animals, I think the problem is because they're part of the food chain. So therefore people have kind of different outlook than a dog and a cat. So, and it's surviving people also outside a plant-based diet. I mean, those people who can't survive without a plant-based diet, then will eat animals.
Right. Yes, you?
I would just say, I personally wouldn't want to be born into a prison where I was artificially inseminated and segregated by sex I'm like, I mean, that's no kind of existence. I was not to be born into that. I think it's simple.
All right, okay. The man back there, please.
In my experience, people don't ask the question exactly in that way. They say, just say that if we didn't bring them into existence, they wouldn't exist, so it's better for them to exist. But they don't conclude that we can do whatever we want with them.
Yeah, it's an implicit conclusion, maybe. Maybe I rephrase it a bit different, but that's basically the message, because we created them for a specific purpose. We can also do with them as we please.
In my experience, it's rather if we didn't eat them, they wouldn't exist. So it's not that we can do whatever we want with them, mistreat them, but they wouldn't exist. So it is a benefit for them, for us to eat them, because that's the way they can exist. And I think that's the way that the argument is formulated. Animal liberation. I think behind that there's also a great lack of knowledge of how the animals are actually treated. That they do believe, I think people would be quite convinced that it's not right to bring an animal, or just like for a human, into a life of intense suffering, and they don't realize that that's what is being done to the animals.
Right, yeah, that's a variation of this. Excellent. But we still haven't really addressed the question you asked, because you said, what can we reply when people say there's a difference between humans and animals, so what are you talking about? So that is what I said at the beginning. That's a kind of a foundational argument. What can we do in support of animal rights? Well, how can we define this? And my reply would be, before Stas gets his turn, I would say that the basic thing is that animals are sentient beings, right? That is something which is beyond debate today. I think most people really believe that. They're individuals. Their lives can be better or worse for them. And the fact that we bring them into existence, especially domesticated animals, through this fact, we incur some kind of obligation to care for them as well. So as some of the others already said, with children it's the very same thing. If you bring a child into existence, you automatically get this obligation or this duty to care for this child. So if a child and a baby animal more or less have the same kind of experiential potentials and capacities, experience pain, pleasure, and these kinds of things, I don't really see what could be a valid argument, apart from the fact that you already presuppose a speciesist assumption, that you already say there is a distinction. And the question is how to overcome this and try to show people that we should erase this distinction and show the similarities. And the best thing I always do, or the best thing I can recommend, is try to show how animals react. Maybe you relate a story about this. Yeah? There are nice stories about what animals can do, that cows sometimes just try to get their calves in secrecy outside of a barn and hide it somewhere for a couple of days or weeks in order not to get these calves taken away from them. So that shows a lot of things, emotional-wise, also cognitive-wise, what these animals and individuals can do. So maybe that is something to reach people like that.
It's really what I use, actually, because sometimes I'm not sure I should use like people compare, okay, we compare what we do animals to Holocaust.
Yeah, the comparisons are difficult, yeah.
People won't respond well to that. So usually it's what I say, I take animals as individuals because of who they are, so try to, I use that. So that's why I'm just wondering if comparing what we're doing to animals to like what we've done to human beings or we're still doing it.
It can fire back. It is dangerous, definitely, yes. We need to be sensitive, absolutely. Yes, I agree with you. Stas.
Compare them to dogs and cats. For example, most people, if they had a dog and they raised that dog and the dog got to be really old and sick, they would euthanize it because they realized that prolonged life, once again, is not that good for him. So if you can agree on the dog that to exist in suffering is a bad thing, then it's a less leap of faith to go from the dog to the cow than from a human to the cow. Although personally I think it is also very important to relate to the fact that human beings also, you can also compare the human suffering, but if you do not want to, you can go through the animals that humans already think that they have emotions and basic rights.
Because I agree with, for me it's the same. I mean, it's what I believe, but I know it's not, people don't respond well when I say that. So definitely.
So that's why I stressed this fact at the beginning. You need alternative strategies, surrogate strategies, and sometimes strategies just to back up your case, otherwise it will go wrong. Okay, let's move on. I'll briefly show you what I've got. It's basically what you said. The presupposition implied here that any form of life, regardless of its quality, is always better than non-existence, is certainly false. Right? That's nonsensical. The quality of life of most domesticated animals in factory farms or laboratories is very low. Therefore, bringing a being into perfectly miserable existence is not a benefit and doesn't work as a justification. And even if the quality of life of domesticated animals in factory farms or laboratories were sufficiently high for them to choose life over non-existence, it wouldn't follow that we may make them suffer and take their lives in return for benefiting them. Bringing a being into existence doesn't give one free rein over them, but implies an obligation to care for them instead. Right. Number 3, it's a classic, the lack of reciprocity. Animals can't have rights because they don't respect our rights, because they can't have duties or obligations. The classic example is the lions, right? The lions eat animals, and even animals' rights activists. Right? That's the bad news. They don't make any difference between the hunter or the poacher and the animal rights activists, either of them. Right? So why do you crazy people care about these animals? What would be your reply?
I always say that animals just follow their instincts, and people can think about things to decide not to eat animals. Animals are not capable of thinking, I'm a lion, I'm going to eat grass. It's not possible.
No moral conflict in lions then. Yeah. Right, good, excellent.
Back to the sentient creatures, I think is the rock bottom.
Sentience. Right, good.
To argue with a lot of things about the sentient creatures.
Yes, sentient creatures, and that's why we have to, no matter whether they can reciprocate. Okay, good. Yes, you, please. You'll be next. No, you, please. You will be next, okay?
Usually the sort of people who make this argument think that humans are intellectually and morally superior to animals, so how can they have that view and then expect that humans should predicate their morals on animals?
Yes. Right, so I turn to animals for moral guidance, more or less, yeah? Okay. Good, your point?
Concerning this, let's say, fact for the person, it would be really strange if I said, okay, there is an animal in front of me alive, and it doesn't respect my rights, so I want to kill it and eat it instead of caring of it. So I know that this animal maybe respect my rights less than I respect his rights, but doesn't follow that it's my, let's say, instinct to eat it.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway.
Absolutely, I agree with you. Any more comments? Stas? Fire away.
Yeah. This is of course false, because we do not give the right for life free of suffering just based on the ability to live out some duties or obligations. We do not eat retarded people. We do not eat people who cannot vote,
babies,
or cannot
yeah.
go to the military, or cannot pay for, we do not eat them.
No.
We also realize that, for example, the animals that we consider pets, our dogs and cats, also do not have a right to vote, but we are very severely outraged when they are hurt in a certain way. So we know that there is no connection between the moral basic right to exist without being abused and having those duties. Those duties are, if you want a cow to be a citizen, then perhaps it would need to fulfill some duties. But we're not talking about this issue.
Not really, no. Very good point. Thank you. Right, yes.
No, it's a bit the same, but it's just to point out that it's a logical non sequitur. That it seems to have some kind of logic in it. It's just a verbal symmetry between rights and that if you don't respect others' rights, or if you don't have obligations, you can have no rights.
Exactly.
Or they should spell out such a connection.
Yes, even though I agree with you in general, there are some people who believe this. Contractarians, for example, right? Contract theory is exactly based on this assumption, right? So you kind of respect those people who respect you, right? So, but that is of course something which is not quite exactly what coincides with our moral intuitions, I think. Very quickly, my suggestions. Although animals indeed don't or can't respect our rights, this argument unfairly reinforces the negative image of animal behavior as red in tooth and claw by ignoring pro-social and cooperative behaviors in domesticated and to some extent even wild animals. So most people refer to the lion or the shark eating the animal rights activists. Right? There are lots of other animals who, even though they do not understand the concept of rights and act accordingly, they're not moral agents. That's not what I'm suggesting. But still, they show something like a pro-social, cooperative behavior. And that is something like a pre-form or what we call morality today. They understand they can't do certain things, right? The reciprocity view confuses self-interest with ethics. According to our common sense understanding, morality flows out of altruistic motives rather than egoistic ones. So a moral code based on this reciprocity view assumes I only do things which are beneficial for me, right? I respect your rights because you respect my rights. I get a benefit, and I have this in a calculation. So and basically this does not really square with what we feel is ethical. And even if reciprocity plays some part in ethics, it certainly can't be the last word, as it excludes not only animals, but also human non-persons. The case of human non-persons sufficiently illustrates that having rights is not conditional on being capable of having duties, obligations, and goes to show the responsibility or the possibility of an asymmetry between rights and duties. That is the point that Stas made. Right, here's the next one. That is, I call this nature as the normative. And there are two variations of this. The first one is an appeal to animal nature. I call this the moral paragon. Animals kill and eat each other, so we can kill and eat them. Nature is red in tooth and claw, and we're just fulfilling some kind of part in this whole bloody play. Yes?
I mean, the basic, you're off ski. Are you a lion? Do you look like a lion? That's not a lion.
Not a lion, that's it? Right. Okay, good.
There's been interesting evolution, if you don't mind the pun, in evolutionary science, away from survival of the fittest, which has also been used to justify cutthroat economics, to communitarian webs of self-support. And one more enlightened geneticist who really sort of kind of underlined this by stating that he would die for 2 of his brothers and 4 of his cousins, having calculated that 2 of those people or 4 of the cousins would contain his exact DNA. And it's also looking at sort of kind of communitarian webs of life as in superorganisms, Earth, Gaia, and so forth. I think helps break away from this way of looking at it like that.
Yes, absolutely. Any more? Yes.
Well, the natural behaviour of animals is predatory whilst we're not predatory.
That's a very good point, yes. Right, so it's an overgeneralization, right? So animals kill each other, right? I have never seen a cow eating another cow, for example. I don't know if you have. Right, but that's a good point, yes. I think it was you, and then you.
I think in this case it's very important, I think it's very important for me to say why I'm acting like I'm acting, and I see the lion, and maybe I have a problem with the lion eating other animals, but before I blame the lion, I have to think about what I'm doing, and I know that I have empathy, and if there's a problem with killing, if I have a problem with killing, the first thing that I do is stopping killing myself. And this is what I did because of my empathy. And first I do the right thing, and then I look at the other problem.
Okay, thank you. Right. It was simultaneously. Maybe ladies first and then you? Right.
Oh, me?
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, I agree. Yeah, absolutely. Animals do, and they go out and they chase chase each other, but that's not what we do. We don't kill animals. We pay someone else to capture them and put them in a machine. That's not the same thing. And not that I would do it or that I applaud it, but I don't necessarily have a problem with other people killing for survival when it's a fair fight and it's your life versus their life, which is why animals kill and eat each other. It's completely different. That is not what we do.
Exactly. So, yeah, the delegation aspect is one thing. Absolutely. In a survival situation, you have to. If you don't want to accept your own demise, it's the only thing you can do.
This thing assumes that what happens in nature is just. So I always say, so if something happens in nature, it's okay. And I always say, when it's pretty funny, like monkeys throw shit at each other. Should we do that as well? Lions should eat, so you should eat meat as well.
Right, yes. So exactly, we stop here, right? We only take this as a moral paragon, animals as moral paragons in this respect. So they also practice infanticide, they practice all kinds of things where we find rather abhorrent, but we are selective. We just pick out the one practice where we say, yeah, that's natural, let's do it.
So I took a sentence from speech, like when lions meet for the first time, they sniff the other lion's butt.
Yeah. Backside, yeah.
Yeah, and I asked if you do it too, because if you want to be like a lion, so you should do exactly what he does. And for instance, when another lion finds babies of another male lion, he kills them.
Yes, infanticide,
You
yeah.
don't do that, so why do you refer yourself to animals if you don't act like them? And on the other side, you don't want me to compare animals to people, and you just did it. Because obviously you compared yourself to a lion or another.
Absolutely. All right, I see lots of hands, but I've still got lots of arguments. Would you like to stay with this argument for more time, or would you like to see more arguments? You haven't spoken so far, so it's your chance.
Is backed up by scientific evidence is relevant for this argument. The point is that we humans, when we evolved from Neanderthals to Homo sapiens, the cannibals obviously were killing and eating each other. But we learned to cooperate with each other, and that's how, like Richard Dawkins in his book Selfish Gene, he comes up with this argument that the cooperative genes, it done in an altruistic way, so if there is no scientific reason for that, but it only helps humans basically, so that it's a survival basically. And why don't we accept the argument that why don't we encompass all other species, and if we cooperate with each other, we don't kill each other. So that's the scientific evidence for that the selfish gene or whatever you call it, it helps in the humans or the whole species' benefit, the survival's benefit.
Yeah, yeah. But the problem is the genes are more or less focused on the species. Yeah, that is a problem.
Like a holistic approach. Why not we just send an argument to Richard Dawkins is talking all the time all about human. I mean, he's basically species.
Yes.
He doesn't care for the species. He's a mediator.
I know.
Why doesn't he look beyond the human species?
Yeah. But I think the problem here is the difference between biological evolution and its principles and moral evolution. So that's something which is very hard to reconcile. That's where many people are trying to get their heads around at the moment, how to reconcile these things, because there are contradictions. Let's move on, shall we? Because there are lots of more things I would like to share with you, and I just need to go on. The first one, that's what you said. Not all animals are predators or carnivores, but almost none of the animals we breed, raise, kill, and eat are predators or carnivores. Even if you focus on these animals, on predators, they need to kill in order to survive, as their physiology and their metabolism are specialized. This doesn't hold true for humans, though. So, as you said, it's a life or death situation for them. They have to kill, otherwise they would die. Even if predatory animals could survive without meat, they would still not be moral agents, right? They can't reflect ethically, they can't make moral choices, and can't act accordingly. They are amoral. Turning to amoral beings for moral guidance seems odd. Right, so there's a variation of this one, which I've also heard lots of times. It's also an appeal to animal nature, but it's retribution this time. Animals kill and eat each other, so they deserve to be killed and eaten too. Right, so basically the same thing applies here. It fails this argument because it doesn't make this crucial distinction between immoral and amoral, right? amoral beings, predatory animals, can't be proper objects of moral sanctions. We can't sanction them morally. So you're a bad guy. Right? We're going to punish you for not acting morally. So that is absurd, right? Right, okay. There's another appeal to nature, but this time to human nature, not to animal nature. Right? We don't appeal to the way animals act, but we appeal to the way humans act. So many people say killing and eating animals is part of human nature. Right? So they leave out the animals, but say it's part of our nature. There's one already standing up. Fire away.
I want sex with you.
Right? You might be categorized as a sexual offender now, right? In this society, unfortunately. Right, Stas.
It's similar to the previous argument, because we hate being natural. There is nothing humans hate more than being natural. If we like being natural, we'd live in the savannah or the forest or in caves. We like to be dressed up, which is definitely not part of human nature. We go to the supermarket, and the supermarket is where the chain of life stops, because it's not a chain of a predator kills a herbivore and a herbivore. Just go to a supermarket. You don't care about nature in any other thing you do. You probably give me this argument on a computer. How is a computer part of human nature? There is nothing that we like about nature. We despise nature as a species. We are the most unnatural thing we do. So why only this thing is referred to nature?
Right.
And as the charming sexual offender said, there are a lot of things that are very natural to people, and we try to fight them as well. It's very natural for us to kill each other, and we kind of made that immoral. And it's natural for us to rape each other, and we made that immoral as well, and we're trying to fight it. So if killing each other and raping each other, which are obviously parts of human nature because people do it all the time, if we make that immoral and we fight that, it means that we agree that occasionally fighting human nature is a moral thing to do.
Right, good. Okay, that's basically what I have. And I have one more thing to say, which I find very important here, is defining the natural, what is natural, is notoriously difficult, right? And it's highly controversial. And this is in particular so as what is defined as natural is subject to changes. So some people like to, even some animal rights advocates like to refer to the natural because they say the human body is in fact an omnivore, if anything, or maybe even a herbivore by nature. Right? Look at the teeth, look at all this. This is very dangerous and very unhelpful, I think. Look at lactose intolerance. Right? That's a thing which was unnatural for human beings before the domestication of animals. And in some regions of the world, it is still unnatural because people in Asia sometimes have trouble with that, digesting these kinds of products. However, biologists found out, they said, people in the Western world, in northern countries, they adopted their metabolism, just kind of adopted to digesting animal products. So consuming dairy products now is a natural thing for human beings. So the natural is not something which is essentially fixed for all time. It is subject to change, and it just depends on how long has it been going on. If it has been going on for long enough, we call it natural, but this can also change. So I would advise strongly against using the natural in any way, because it is not a clearly definable thing. Right? So this is basically what I've said so far. And that's what Stas said. Even if it were clear what exactly is natural for humans, it still wouldn't follow that natural could be equated with the good or right in the ethical sense. We don't blindly accept the natural as a normative, but often interfere with it on moral grounds. And the natural is often used to justify immoral practices. Right? In the past, it was a view that, black people are natural slaves, or it's also natural for people to do this or that, as you already pointed out quite well. So, inferring the rule from the exception is the next one. People who live under extreme climatic and or geographic conditions have the right to kill and eat animals in order to survive. Therefore, we may also kill and eat animals. Because, and that is the silent assumption, it can't be categorically wrong to do that. Isn't that true? Eskimos or Inuit kill whales, seals, all kinds of nice, cute animals in order to survive. Doesn't that give us some right to go to the supermarket and just shop? What do you think?
It's the same as with the lion. I can say I have the possibility not to eat it, not to eat animals, so I don't do it due to my empathy. That's
Right.
it.
Right? Far in the back. Can you stand up, please? Because it's...
Specific difference between killing and eating and mocking animals other than eating them.
Pardon? I didn't get that.
There's a substantially different difference between killing and eating animals to survive or to mistreat them all their lives and lock them up in cages.
So at least you say these animals had a life freedom.
I would rather live as a fish and being eaten by an Eskimo than live in Luxembourg as a factory animal.
Right, okay. So this life is definitely better because it's only the moment when you're being killed or hunted that there's some suffering involved. Right, yes.
In extreme conditions, people tend to become cannibals also. So would that argument be valid that people then can start eating humans, other humans? So there are many instances where people have and Andes have airplane crash in 70s and people lived on the dead bodies for maybe for 10 years. So is the argument that everyone should start eating and killing humans as well?
Yes, I think under extreme conditions we had these cases where people resort to eating other humans, right? So that is still something which is kind of a taboo, right? But the question is exactly what can be done in these lifeboat situations. Yes. The man in the back, please.
Well, perhaps it's not categorically wrong, but it still is wrong. Well, there is still a difference. They need to survive. We don't need meat to survive. And for me, it's just the morally relevant difference here. It doesn't need to be categorically wrong.
I think, yeah, that is the false premise which is always included here to make this whole argument more or less sound. Okay. There are extraordinary situations in which actions that are generally considered morally unacceptable can become justifiable. Self-preservation or subsistence and self-defense represent such ordinary situations where the only alternative to killing and or eating other beings is one's own demise. Exceptions from a general principle in extraordinary situations do not call the principle or its general validity into question. A general principle can't be inferred from an extraordinary situation. So why should we base our entire moral code on life or death situations? Right. The same also goes, of course, for vegans, right? That's the same argument is used. Even vegans or animal rights activists kill and eat animals under extreme conditions. And we already had, I think, lots of answers or replies to that. Of course, we would do that, right? But maybe we would also kill and eat other human beings. Who knows? I wouldn't rule it completely out, at least. If you're really hungry, I don't know. But there's another thing which is important. That's the reproach of hypocrisy. Animal rights advocates and vegans kill animals too, even under normal conditions. So we're not talking about this life or death thing, right? We're talking about normal conditions here. And that is usually the context of agriculture, right? So we love plants, we have to farm plants, we have to make sure they grow and do everything. So you as vegans try to blame non-vegans for a practice you are involved in yourself. This reeks of double standards and hypocrisy, right? There are lots of small animals like mice and even smaller creatures which are harmed and killed in the process of agriculture. So if you harvest the crops, for example, you've got certain machines, and it is a fact that small animals are killed in this process. There's no denying that, right? So what can we do about this? Oh, that was not Do you want to reply anyway? Who hasn't said anything so far? Come on. Yes, please. But you have to speak up a bit, I'm afraid.
Not have any, but that doesn't mean that that shouldn't stop
Very good. That is a very good point. I would like to add something because it is my personal conviction, and I might not endear myself to some of you here now, but I think the term or the label vegan should in fact mostly apply to products and things which are really vegan, because it's almost impossible to apply to humans. There's so many things where people could say, yeah, but you're not a vegan because there's some kind of practice you're involved in, if it's only crossing the grass or driving your car. So maybe it would be a good idea to not as often use the label vegan for people, because it's almost impossible. Imagine people who have a vegan diet, have a vegan lifestyle, but need some kind of medication, otherwise it would be hard for them to live, which is the case for many people. Are they vegan? Are they not? Strictly speaking, not. Yes?
I would like to respond to that, because then you couldn't call a product vegan either, because you need to cut across the product.
That is another problem, yeah, but it might...
I'm working on labeling products, and where do you draw the line?
That's a good point, yeah. But I think it might be a little bit easier to do it there than, because products might be the technological progress might allow us one day maybe to have harvesting methods which reduce dramatically or even avoid killing and suffering on behalf of small creatures. That's just a theoretical thought. But thanks for the contribution, Stas.
This is not a question.
No, it's an argument, it's a statement.
No, what I mean is, it is not a question, it is an exclamation. And what this person tries to tell you, you are trying to take the higher moral ground with me, you are preaching to me, and you are attacking my dissonance, and this is my way to fight back. This is not a question, because it requires, it cannot be answered, it is not even a question. What I would do in this case, and once I realize that I'm dealing with a person who is feeling attacked, is to stop attacking him, and as Steen said in his lecture, how to dispel this dissonance and how to focus on the similarities. And you would go to say that, first of all, we are kind of aware that we are not perfect. We do not strive to be perfect. We just, we're in a direction of trying to change things and to decrease to the possible minimum of harm we are doing. So what we're trying to do here, we are saints. We did this, we stopped eating meat, and now there's a freaking halo around my head now. That's not the case. What we're trying to do, we're trying to show that this practice of eating, consuming, industrialized meat, it causes so much harm that by reducing that, you reduce such a large amount of suffering that it is a worthy cause to pursue. It does not make you immediately a saint. It does not make you morally superior, although we probably believe that we are still morally superior, but it is a thing to say. And you should also perhaps tell them that if you consider the enormity of the things that you can stop by simply doing this small negative duty of stopping, then it is such an easy thing to do, and if you practice it yourself, you are already reducing a huge amount of harm. So, which we are really not that different. We're just choosing to reduce some of the harm. We're trying to make the place better. We're not judging you. We're just trying, to make this place better.
Right. Excellent. I think that's good last words. I think we're running out of time. Thanks a lot for your participation. Yeah, that's a related argument. Yeah, some people also say that you can't eat plants, or because you eat plants and they also suffer, you can also eat animals. That's a different, but that's related to that, yes. But this is more about not killing the plants, but killing the animals in the process. Thanks a lot for your participation. Take care. It was great fun.